Hey everyone, this is the third video in our video series on functions. In this video we will be covering function chaining. Before we get into function chaining, let's go over some of the functions we saw last time. We saw a function that was named ABS, and this function would take in as input a negative number or a positive number and return as output the absolute value of that number. So for example, if we sent it -3, it would return to us 3. If we sent it in 2, it would just return 2, so on and so forth. So I'm going to scoot that over here. And let's look at another function we saw last time, which was, I'm not going to do that. Another function we saw last time, which was the max function. So in this max function, we would actually send it 2 numbers and it would return the maximum of those 2 numbers. So for example, say we sent it 2 and we sent it 3, it would return the larger of the 2, which was 3. So again, this function takes in 2 inputs but returns 1 output. Now, again, these are the 2 functions we saw last time, but let me pose another question for you. What if instead I wanted to make a function, or I wanted to make a program that took in 2 numbers, but instead of returning the max of the 2 numbers as they were, it returned the maximum absolute value of the numbers. So for example, if we had, right now the way this function works, if we sent it 2 and -3, it would return to us 2, as 2 is larger than -3. But instead what we want is, we want this function to return, or we want to make something that returns to us 3, as 3 is still, although it's negative, is still a larger absolute value. We want it to return 3. And to do this, we can use the concept of function chaining. So we already have a function that takes absolute values, so we can use that and then feed its output into this other function, the max function. So let me select this and move it over. What we'll see is, right here where before we have these 2 numbers, -2 and -3, what we're going to do is we're going to say, well, instead of taking those numbers directly and putting them in, we're going to first feed them in through our ABS function and then send that in. So, we take these. Now what we see is, let's say we were to send in, again, we start with the numbers 2 and -3, but now we feed them through our absolute value function, so we get the output of 2 and 3, and then 2 and 3 get sent into our max function, which outputs again 3, which is what we were originally looking for, right? Because 3 has a larger or -3 has an absolute value of 3, which is larger than 2's absolute value of just 2. So that's the concept of function chaining. It's basically taking your original input, or what you're working with, and feeding it through a series of steps or functions to eventually get the output you're looking for. Now let's look at how this looks in code. So again, let's say we have our number x, which is 2, and our number y, which is -3. Again, to start with, we were just saying max of x and y, which would print out 2, because that's the larger of the 2 numbers. But now instead we want to print out the larger absolute value. To do that, what we can do is call the absolute value function before sending it into max. So we could say ABS of x and ABS of y. And again, this is exactly how our diagram did it, where it took x, sent it to the absolute value function, and then took that output and put it into the input of max, and then the same thing with y. It takes the absolute value of y, which is 3, and then uses that as input into the max function. If we run this, we'll see now that we have an output of 3. This is exactly what function chaining is. Another example of this might be, let's say we had two strings, A and B, which are hello, and B, which is bye, and we wanted to print out what the larger length was. So we want to use the max function because we're looking for the larger of the two. But instead of taking the strings directly, because those are strings, max doesn't know how to work with strings, we'll take the length function and send that as input into our max function. So now we're saying, take the length of A, take the length of B, and then take the max of those two. So if we run this, we'll see that we get 5, which is, again, the 3 is from this first print statement. The 5 is because A has a length of 5, which is larger than B's length of 3. This is what function chaining is. We'll start to see more and more examples of this in our future videos. But next time, in our next video, what we'll be covering is how do you make your own function. Thank you for joining me, and see you next time.